Hello, welcome. My name is Susan Barker. I'm going to share with you today my home garden here in Fort Worth, Texas. Jeff and I live here in the Rosemont area, fairly central, south central Fort Worth. I have volunteered as a Tarrant County Master Gardener and with the Tarrant Area Food Bank's Learning Garden, and I currently work for the Tarrant Area Food Bank in their community gardens and farmers market nutrition programs. But today we're just going to talk about my home garden. This isn't going to be a technical video. We're just going to do a tour and walk through and see some inspiration for some options for growing food and beauty in relatively small space. Now, some of you who do container gardening from your patio will say this is a huge space. This is a just under 1.5 tenths of an acre residential lot, so it's 50 feet wide by 120 feet long. We do not have a homeowners association here, so we don't need to worry about any rules there. In the city of Fort Worth, we do have a high weed rule, and when we first moved in, this was all just turf and a house. And we wanted to see what grew, so we let it grow up. And sure enough, we got that warning citation that we would need to mow. So from then on, we instead did some digging, dug up all this Bermuda bit by bit, section by section, and have replaced it. So I am going to point out some of my observations as we walk through about interplanting, some pest control methods, attracting beneficials, irrigation, a little bit about composting, nothing technical though, some options for raised beds and trellises on a budget, and I'll point out some of my favorite plant varieties that do well in this area. As we dug this out, we did take advantage of the city's free mulch program. So we would dig out the Bermuda, add compost when we had it, and then do a deep, thick layer of mulch. A lot of the mulch that you'll see in our beds today is actually store-bought mulch. Once we have plants growing that we eat or use in a culinary way, we generally use the store-bought mulch because we don't know where the city mulch, what plants they're from. So you can see the difference. Here's some store-bought mulch, and this side of the garden we dug the Bermuda out. This side is mulch from the city, so it's perfectly fine. And this we actually sheet mulched, the very, very thoroughly black plastic for about 6 months, and then we did cardboard and hay and compost. And these peach trees are from a neighbor. Our neighbors are a tremendous resource, not only their experience growing in this area, but also their skills at propagating the abundance of their garden. They've shared so many plants with us, like those peach trees. You'll notice some elements in our garden. We do have some elements of permaculture, although we in general have a pretty loose garden, method, garden technique. But you will see, for example, here in this red bud guild, we have a tree layer with this beautiful red bud, which blooms. They're blossoms that we eat. We can make into jams. They're also attractive to the beneficials. This is a nitrogen fixing plant. It's a legume, and so the things we plant around it benefit from that. This comfrey accumulates nutrients from deeper into the soil for the other plants. It also is a living mulch. And we have alliums under here. These garlic chives help deter pests. And they produce they're edible and they produce an edible blossom. They also have really shallow roots. And we benefit from the shade too. That means we can grow kale even in these hot months. So when I say permaculture principles, I'm just talking about, you know, it's our effort to have a consciously diverse, stable, resilient ecosystem. You know, that's why you'll see a lot of perennials here in some of our beds. And these ecosystems, we try to imitate really the complex natural systems that we see that thrive. So no waste, closed-looped systems. And we do have some of that, and we're working toward improving on a lot of that. For example, we do use rainwater that we harvest, but you'll see we have porous hose and drip irrigation, and at the moment those are not connected to our rainwater collecting systems, but we do hope that they will be. This is Pavonia rock rose. Doesn't it look happy here in the heat of July? And throw in some squash plants where you have space. We plant, this is a lemon squash, so that's ripe, ready to harvest. We plant squash successionally throughout the garden because it's our first year to grow summer squash because of all the pest pressure that we hear so much about. And we have seen some of that, so I'll show you some other methods of, that's one, succession sowing throughout your garden. Try to stay ahead of those pests. And we have some more methods in the backyard as well. I do want to talk a little bit about interplanting, also called companion planting. I like to call them plant communities. In permaculture, sometimes we call them guilds, plant guilds. To me, the takeaway from all of those is that we're finding plants that enjoy growing together. And so here's one example. This area is the furthest away from our home, so we want low maintenance. It gets full sun, so we need plants that can take the heat. We don't want to be out here trucking a hose or buckets of water, so we want plants that do not take a lot of water. So we have chosen these plants that are in the same hydrozone. They have the same water requirements. They have the same sun requirements. They take full sun. They're very hardy plants. We also have chosen these plants because they successionally bloom. So you'll see the Salvia greggii that's looking a little scraggly now. In the early spring, it was in full bloom, just covered. And now we have these beautiful skullcap blossoms that kind of steal the show. And we also have the desert willow blooming, and its colors play very well with the neighbor's crepe myrtle blooming as well. And then behind, coming up with these spires that will grow taller, is the Russian sage that really steals the show in the late summer and fall. So it's just starting to bloom here. So that's one way to think about interplanting. Another way to think about it is, like I talked about with that permaculture method, where you have lots of different layers, from your tree layers to shrubs to herbaceous plants, ground covers, and under the ground, under the soil growth, and also vertical growth. And also plants that are multifunctional, like I described some of those plants to be. And then a third way that I think about it is more like a companion planting way. So this rose plant is done with its second bloom for the year. You can see it gets lots of airflow, which it likes, but it is surrounded, its feet are covered up by these really beautifully fragrant herbs. And so that helps to deter pests. It helps keep the rainwater off of the foliage of the rose to prevent the spread of fungus. And they're plants that are evergreen perennials, so they always have foliage year round. So that was culinary sage, and here's our thyme. rosemary. Agave, one of the first plants we got from our neighbor. Now, one of the benefits of having a small tree like this red bud that's also a nitrogen fixer is that we can have this space for a little annual bed here, and so we do plant this annual bed every season. Swiss chard is a fun plant to have. It just looks so good most of the year. Very ornamental for a vegetable. And it's a biennial, so it lasts a good long while too. Now this other side where we've sheet mulched is really taking a long time for the soil to settle, and we have really taken a low maintenance approach over here, as you can see. And while it does look raggedy, we have several potato plants. They are quite leggy, but they do produce potatoes. We threw down this porous hose. You don't see it on the other side because it's covered with mulch like it should be. So we're working on that. But these are perennial onions, and you can see they're also called walking onions. They spread, and what they do is they grow, and every part of this plant is edible. So they grow like an onion, so you can eat them from down here at the base, just like any onion. It's not a bulb onion, but it's almost like a big spring onion, so you can just pull this whole clump out anytime and eat it. In the spring, when they're tender green shoots, you can eat those like spring onions, and then they will bloom on this flowering stalk and will produce bulblets, and we have some right down here. And as the bulblets grow, you can eat these just like onions as well. They will fall down to the ground and root themselves and grow, and here's some that are starting to grow some foliage. So they'll send down their roots and they'll grow up. So it's a really low maintenance perennial onion that takes the shade, and you can see, I don't know if you can tell in there, but there's lots of new little onions growing. So this is a fun thing to have. You can give this away. It's very productive, so I take up clumps of it and produce it all at once and freeze the roots for soup stocks, and use the rest of it in, you know, scrambled eggs and sautés, and just use it for everything. These are some of my favorite flowers right now, these cactus zinnias. You'll see them in the backyard as well. I wanted to point out we have some more kale growing here, and you can see that we've been harvesting this kale for weeks from the bottom. We harvest the bottom leaves first, and it just keeps growing up and up. We have had pest pressure from caterpillars. In fact, I think I see one over here that I'll be able to show you, but that's what this damage is when you see these leaves eaten, except for the vein there. Now that is a little different from this. This is grasshopper poop, believe it or not. It's very big, I know. And you can see how this grasshopper has just munched the whole side of this leaf. Really rough, whole section's gone. That's grasshoppers. Whereas the caterpillars make these kind of holes. Oh, here's one. And we just hand pick them. We get different kinds of caterpillars. We just hand pick them, and typically they come all at once. You know, someone lays some eggs here, and they all are born, and it takes us a while to find them, and then we hand pick them for several days, and the plant generally comes back. Now, kale prefers cooler weather, so you'll notice if we do have kale, we have it in a lot of shade here in the warmer times of the year. And then this fall, we plant it in full sun to overwinter. Here's an area of low maintenance. Again, you'll see some of the tried and trues. This is that four-nerve daisy that does so well in the heat and sun. This is a copper canyon daisy that blooms in the fall. It's very fragrant. Some people really enjoy it, some people don't. Hello, dove. Excuse me. We do have some basil and a couple of tomatoes that we didn't have space for otherwise, but I didn't have another home for them, so I went ahead and planted them here with our lemon balm and basil that we keep contained here on the side of the house so it doesn't take over the world. And these cannas are from a neighbor. She just dug them up. She's so sweet. Some clover ground cover. She just dug them up out of her yard and gave them to us, and so we've had them in several different places in the yard. They do very well here until they do get some foliage damage, and we don't do much to treat it, so we kind of have it tucked back here for that stage. But man, it sure is pretty right now at its peak. We did not, these trumpet vines were here, we did not plant them, and I would not recommend them. Supposedly there are varieties that don't invade every space. You can see them there. They just come up everywhere. They attach onto the house and root into the wood of the siding, so we have to be really careful to cut those back all the time. Composting. So this is our dual tumbler composting system by Lifetime, and we've had this for over 4 years now. It costs roughly $150 to $200. I think it was a great purchase, and I highly recommend it, especially for folks who have someone in the household who thinks that compost is unsightly or stinks or invites pests. You'll see this is a closed system, so no rodent pests can get in, so it doesn't attract them. I will say though, this does require some maintenance that we have neglected to perform, and that is in all these metal pieces. You can see there's moisture in the composting process, and we neglected to spray any kind of protection for these metal pieces, so they are rusting out now. So if you do buy something like this, take the time to invest in that so you don't make the same mistake as we did, because now it's really hard to get these to turn and the lid doesn't work properly. But you open the lid here and put in your food waste. We just keep a bowl in the kitchen and dump it out every night, and Jeff does that actually. And then we also add leaves when we need to, but you can see there's not bugs flying around here. There is some insect life inside the tumblers, but they're not visible. There's also not any kind of smell. So don't let anyone tell you that you can't compost in the city. I mean, that compost system's not bothering anybody. Now, if you have neighbors or family members in your household that just can't stand it, the city of Fort Worth does have a composting program, and they will provide you with a little tub, and you can deliver your compost to one of their delivery stations. So you have no excuse. You can compost. This is some chocolate mint that a friend gave. It is like Thin Mints in a plant. I love it. So we have it right here near the pathway so that when we walk by, we brush against it and smell it. This is our back stock of leaves for our composting system, both the tumblers and also our 3-bin system here, which is not really in use right now. You'll see that we actually have let these volunteer squash grow this year. So you can just barely see back there our homemade 3-bin system, just with scraps of materials that we repurposed. So the general theory is that you start building your compost in one bin, and once it gets full, you turn it into the next bin to introduce oxygen. You can introduce water when you need to, and that way you can start building again in the first bed and then turn them each consecutively in this 3-bed system. And if you do it well, you can have compost by that 3rd bin. We do not produce a lot of compost. You can see we're a little, I wouldn't say lazy, but it's not something that we really work hard at. We actually have gotten compost delivered to us lately. There is a big pollinator back there, but it's hiding inside that blossom. So these are just butternut squash that volunteered, y'all, from our compost bins. And we've already harvested so many acorn squash and butternut squash, and you can see that the plants are doing really well. Now, we did have several of these vines succumb to squash vine borers, and so I pulled them out, pulled out those borers so they couldn't continue their life cycle, and left the plants that looked healthy. We do have a variety of fruit trees. We have a persimmon tree. They're all quite young and not producing heavily. Fig tree. There's a vitex back there that a bird planted for us. And then the very back, I don't know if you can see, there's a pomegranate back there. The neighbors have a pear tree, and they also have a loquat tree. And I consider those as part of our system as well, because we all share. We also have a plum tree in the back there. So I want to point out before I get too far away, sorry for all the motion, we do have a rain tank that feeds off of this one gutter from our house. It's a 780 square foot house, and this is just one. You see there's multiple gutters there, but this is just one gutter off of basically the porch roofing feeds into this, and it's full. So we have this drainage pipe as well. We use this to water mostly our perennial beds right now with buckets, but we do hope to connect this to our drip irrigation system. For now though, it's buckets by hand. Some more of that mint, so every time I get water I get to smell that beautiful mint. So for drip irrigation, what we use is this Haas tool system. This timer is completely optional, as is the quick connect, but we find that really handy. So you can just kind of pop off your nozzle from the hose and pop your hose onto this. Then we set the timer, and we have our filter, our pressure regulator, and our mainline tubing. The mainline tubing connects to these drip lines, which we have these very nice shutoffs. So for plants in different hydro zones, like cucumbers generally want more water than say peppers, and I can choose what lines to turn on and off. Now this main line also comes along here. You'll see it's all buried by mulch to help prevent evaporation, make it a more efficient system. And then the main line is running through this. This is a tube from a wind chime that we found in the garage when we moved in. The main line is fed through there into our other beds. You can see there it is, kind of tucked back. And then same thing over here. So it runs, so we now have the luxury, we just installed this year, we now have the luxury of this drip irrigation in our annual beds. I should mention too, for any of you who are familiar with a YouTube channel called Roots and Refuge Farm, I really dig her style, and you can see it. She has strongly influenced this garden aesthetic. So she is who introduced me to that irrigation system. Although I also learned a lot through the Botanic Gardens classes and Dottie Woodson and Master Gardeners about, that's how I know how to put it together through all of that volunteer work and workshops. But that brand, I had trouble finding at Home Depot and even irrigation stores, finding the things that I wanted. So Haas Tools had exactly the setup I wanted. So, but Roots and Refuge Farm also inspired these arch trellises and this cattle panel tomato wall. You can see a bunch of tie tape. Now, like I said, these tomatoes we planted in early March. We were eating cherry tomatoes in April, and these slicers in May. So these have been producing for quite a while now. And then we have another tomato wall over there. Now these cattle panels are roughly, it depends on where and when you buy them, $20 to $30 for a 16-foot panel like you see there. That panel goes the whole length of that 16-foot bed. We also, it makes a beautiful arch trellis. Now the second arch is actually 2 half cattle panels zip tied together. So there was a time when we couldn't transport the full-size cattle panels, so we bought halves. I think they're called handy panels, and that's what this wall is made of, is 2 8-foot panels. And then we just zip tie them to the T-post. You'll also notice that we do have some sort of informal raised beds. Now this rock is just for decor. Really, these are just mounded up beds. That helps get us a little depth for our root system. And when we dig out the Bermuda grass back here, we dig out every piece of it, chunk by chunk, section by section, And then we put it down, dig in expanded shale, 1 to 3 inches. That's a one-time application, and that helps improve the soil structure. We've actually found that it helps improve drainage significantly in our gardens. And then we apply 3 or more inches of compost and some mineral amendments. I can't get that to focus. Some mineral amendments, and then thick mulch on top. And so we just mound up the soil. Nothing fancy or special about the way we do it. And then you'll see in some places we've used materials from family, or in one instance we went out and bought some wood to build a raised bed. Raised beds do not have to be fancy, and they don't have to be raised too high, you know, 6 inches, a foot or so. But you can make them deeper than that if you want. These are cucamelons, also inspired by Jess at Roots and Refuge Farm. I am having trouble with them. You can see they develop and then they bloom, and I think maybe I'm not getting pollinators enough to them, or maybe they're not getting enough water. They're not getting any bigger. They don't get much bigger than that, but they are supposed to plump up more, about the size of my pinky fingernail. They grow really vigorously, you can see. There's a volunteer zinnia that we welcome into the garden. And then this other arch, we have these beautiful pole beans, our second succession of pole beans. We had peas here in the early spring. We planted pole beans elsewhere in the garden, and then once the peas were done, we planted these pole beans here. And our okra. And then a purple potted pole bean here. So the pole beans have really loved these cattle panel trellises. They've done really well. And you'll notice our cucumber plant looks pretty rough. We've got lots of that powdery mildew, and I need to deal with that. I just haven't. But you can see, thank you honeybee, you can see they actually are still producing. This is a Solly Bueller cucumber, and that's pretty big. They're supposed to be about the size of my thumb. We also have we have beans tucked in around a lot of plants. It's a great companion. It's low growing, fixes nitrogen. Very happy looking. It's always a plus. And then you'll see here we do have this floating row cover. This is our first succession of squash plants, and we have just continued to have this floating row cover over it as a pest deterrent, and it has worked very well. The downside to this system is that you have to hand pollinate these squash. So you do, if you didn't appreciate pollinators before, you do appreciate them after you have to hand pollinate every morning. So the plants aren't as productive. We don't do as good a job of pollinating as the beneficials do, but we haven't had any squash vine borers or squash bugs in here. So it's been worthwhile. And this is a zucchini plant. It's looking very good, and we have had to be very diligent in watching out for squash vine borers. And you can see we did have a couple of squash vine borers come, and they came not on the main stem, but they actually came in one of these leafing stems, and they made their way down, and luckily I caught them right as they got to this main stem, and I was able to kind of dig them out of there. And you can see the plant is scarring over. So that's one way to deal with squash vine borers, is to keep a lookout for their eggs, which are very tiny, but very visible, especially if you're underneath the plant like this. We'll see if I can find any to show you. Oh, there's a couple. So they are very small. I probably won't, there's a decent shot at them. And I just scrape them off with my finger, get them off of there so they can't, what they'll do is they will hatch and the larva will go into the center of the stem, so you can't see it. But what you'll see is the duff from what they're eating. And that's how you know you need to either go digging around for that or try to cut them out somehow. It's nice to get underneath the plant like that and take a look for pests. It's a good way to find the squash bug eggs are usually on the underneath side of leaves. There's a big zucchini we need to harvest. Some more eggs. I'll have to come back and get the rest of those eggs. You can see we have a significant perennial beds, fairly informal perennial beds back here. There's the plum tree that I mentioned. We also have our sweet potato patch back there and some more of that lemon squash. Now that's not covered and it hasn't succumbed to either of those pests yet. We have done that successionally. You saw some in the front. I also want to show, this is one of our favorite plants which came with the property. This is a perennial pepper plant called Chili Pekin. Now I don't dare touch it, but Jeff really enjoys these peppers, so he'll come out and harvest these. Isn't that pretty? Just a happy pepper plant. We don't do a thing to it. We just make sure it has space. Now, for those of you who don't have access to cattle panels like these that the cherry tomatoes are on, and even though they've been producing for months, they still are producing. So we've been really pleased with this system. We're going to try to bring the trellis up even higher next year. But you can see here, we didn't have cattle panels for this area, and instead we came across some bamboo that a neighbor had put out in front of their yard, and we hauled it home and rigged up this trellis system that's working fairly well. This is a Kajari melon plant. Very vigorous grower. It is already into the red bud tree up there, and it is producing these beautiful fuzzy little fruits. And we have some that are maturing even. Now I put these bags around them just so that when they ripen and separate from the vine, they don't fall and bust open when they hit the ground. So this one's close enough to the ground, I don't need to worry about that. And these Kajari melons will ripen to a really bright, deep orangish reddish. So they are not there yet, but the plant seems to be doing very well. And we also have some, this was our first succession of pole beans back here. Those purple pole beans. We also did some bush beans in the back. Now these haven't been super productive because they get limited sunlight, but we have gotten some beans off of them. And we have a couple of cucumber plants here. These are Marketmore cucumbers. Hey, bumblebee. Here's some more of those Marketmores. They're not ready to harvest yet. Getting there. And we also actually have a winter squash that is a vining winter squash, and we decided to grow it on this trellis. And it's doing okay. Here's one of its fruits. Thank you, Guy. Like I said, once you've been hand pollinating a while, these pollinators that do the work for you become like little heroes of the garden. Oh, one other thing over there I forgot to mention. You'll notice here that we do have this PVC piping sticking up with just these, I think it's like electronic conduit brackets. And then we do have hoops for these. So we basically are gonna, over the winter, what we do is a hoop house system here that we can put frost blanket over. So we'll grow our brassicas and kales and everything in this bed over the winter with that. It's basically a modified hoop house greenhouse, except we don't use plastic usually. And then we actually might cover that even with this insect barrier for our brassicas, because that will keep the caterpillars off of them. And those you don't have to hand pollinate, so that will be easier to do. Well, y'all, here comes the sun, the morning sun peeking out. Got some bush beans, oregano, fig tree. There's some garlic chives under there as well. And then one of my favorite spaces is this herbaceous border. Our basils, calendula, more bush beans, a whole row of bush beans back here. Still blooming. We had some chamomile. And tomatoes still growing. This beautiful borage that is actually generally a cool weather plant, but I guess because of our cool spring, it's still happy, and those little blossoms are a sweet little bite of cucumber flavor. You know, edible, delicious in salads. And the calendula opening. Good morning. Now I can deadhead that way more. I just haven't taken the time to do it. Different varieties of basils, interplanted. You can see the alyssums, their season has passed. They were beautiful in the early spring. And now we have these basils and beans and zinnias really on display. And all of that as friends with these tomatoes. These are Dr. Witchy's yellow tomato, really big slicing tomato. They produce really well. They've been really disease resistant. They've been delicious. They've also been the most crack resistant. We've had a lot of cracking of tomatoes this year. Here's more of those cactus zinnias that I love so much. You know, we do a lot of growing what makes us happy. That's the joy of gardening for us in a lot of ways. Almost like building relationships with these plants and getting to see them flourish and grow. It's a Paul Robeson tomato. Those are delicious. Almost like a savory flavor. And these are the Missouri Pink Love Apple tomatoes. And you can see they are cracking. We have had a lot of cracking this year. But nice flush of tomatoes still coming. You know, this is like the third or however flush. You can see how much I've been pruning back as they grow and fruit. Just keep pruning and pruning as they continue to grow. And you'll see there's some disease there. Just prune that out as soon as I can. And I will be taking some of these plants out that look worse, but you can see some of these still look really good. As long as they have space to grow. And we do them in the soil. We do compost tea, and we keep this mulched. When we need to, we use a poultry manure fertilizer. Well, y'all, I hope that you enjoyed this video. I hope that it helped inspire you to see some of the many possibilities for growing in an urban yard, residential yard, growing food, growing beauty, growing abundance. Thank you so much for watching. Happy gardening!